Welcome to Legitimate Matters. I am your host, William Parris. Welcome to the second episode with my very exciting guest, Dr. Richard Smith, oceanographer. In our last episode, we were talking about the relationship between the ocean and climate and why this topic is so important and why we should care about this. Richard, so glad you're here. So,
great to be back.
Well, tell us, why should we even care about the ocean?
Well, to start off with, the ocean is 75% of the Earth's surface area. So when we talk about the Earth and we talk about the globe, we have to talk about the ocean. Mm-hmm. The ocean sustains life as we know it. The ocean plays a huge role in controlling the climate. 1 out of every 7 people on Earth get their primary source of protein from the ocean. All that aside, the ocean is also one of the most amazing ecosystems on the planet. We know less about the deep ocean than we know about the surface of the moon.
And the ocean gives us, balance, right? Isn't there some balance between the ocean and climate and things that sustain life?
Absolutely. In fact, the ocean has picked up a lot of the excess heat that we've put into the atmosphere and a lot of the excess CO2 at its own cost.
All right.
Things like warming and coral bleaching and these beautiful ecosystems, diverse ecosystems being destroyed, ocean acidification. So yeah, it provides wonderful services for us as humanity. So we want to keep it clean and pure and not contaminate it. For example, where I live, Lake Ontario, it's not the ocean, but the Great Lakes system is 25% of the world's surface freshwater. And you can only eat 1 fish meal a month out of the lake. And mercury is spread across the globe. You can't find fish anywhere on the globe that doesn't contain some level of mercury in it. So we do not want to continue that trend.
Well, when we see the movies that come out that talk about or imply global warming and impending disaster on the planet, I think that there's a certain mindset with regard to climate change. What do you think is the general public perception of climate change?
Unfortunately, the public largely thinks that there's a debate on climate change, a scientific debate, and there absolutely isn't. It's a scientific consensus that climate change is happening. It's a scientific consensus that humans are causing it. We know exactly how. We can look at times back in the past to understand what's going to happen and understand that these are not natural climatic changes. These are 100 times more rapid than natural climatic changes. This is 10 times more rapid than the quickest times we can look back in history. So in the previous episode I mentioned there's no historical analog. That doesn't mean we don't know what's happening from looking into the past. It means this is so much more intense than everything we've seen. Now we look like we might be going into the 6th mass extinction, and we're still working this out as scientists in terms of the rate, but we're losing biodiversity everywhere, particularly in the oceans.
Hold on, you just said the number 6, mass, meaning widespread, extinction, meaning annihilation.
Exactly. So everybody knows about the dinosaurs, right? But there's really been 5. And right now we are losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. And it's driven by development. It's
biodiversity. Biodiversity. Break it down.
That's right. So biodiversity is really the number of different the number of different organisms. Okay. So this is basically through time, evolution has created all these species that occupy different niches in the environment.
Okay.
So there's over 16,000 species of fish in the ocean. That's biodiversity.
I see.
There are individual regions and individual lakes where a species lives, and that's the only place they live. So really, we're taking this ecosystem. That's 75% of the, like I said, 75% of the Earth. And there are creatures there that you couldn't make up, especially when you look in the deep ocean. So that's biodiversity. They occupy all these different habitats, from as deep as 11,000 meters in the Marianas Trench. There's life down there, and we don't really know much about it.
Wow. And are you saying that your studies show that this type of life is in danger? Is this what you're saying?
Especially with the deep ocean, we know so little about it that we don't really know how we're affecting it. Especially when we look at global fishing, we know that almost all fish stocks, 80% of fish stocks in the ocean are under immense pressure. And these could also be deep fish stocks that we don't really know a lot about. So my research specifically doesn't touch on fisheries in the deep ocean or in the open ocean. I primarily look at habitat loss in coastal systems, things like mangrove systems that are juvenile nurseries, spawning habitats for fish, and loss of those due to development.
So why is, now, if for myself as a United States citizen, how does that affect me?
Well, for one, we're looking at the ocean's ecosystem as a whole. The ocean actually supplies about 50% of the oxygen in the atmosphere.
There you go.
So we like to breathe. we like to eat fish,
That's
right?
important.
We like seafood, and we don't want seafood that's going to cause us to accumulate contaminants over our lifetime that are going to harm us and our families in the future.
And this is what's happening.
This is what's happening. We want to continue to live in our coastal cities without flooding problems, without land loss, without our sewers and subways flooding.
Wow. So now we're talking about the ecosystem being affected. We're talking about flooding. We're talking about how the sea life is being impacted. So your study, your work, your life work in oceanography is talking about all types of risks to the planet and to humanity that are based on the inability to be able to live where you might live today, since a certain percentage of Americans live along the coast. So so the coastal areas are at risk. Being able to consume seafood could cause some type of health issues down the road. Am I on the right track with this?
Absolutely. You know what? My research looks at how all the systems as a whole on Earth are connected. That's why they call it biogeochemical cycling. It's biology, it's geology, and it's the chemistry and how all these systems are linked.
Wow.
Let me give you an example. Increased wildfires, like we're seeing in the western U.S., actually caused increased amounts of soot on the Greenland ice sheet, which actually causes way more rapid melting, because they absorb tons of heat and they create these crevasses in the ice whereby it can lubricate the ice and slip it out into the ocean. So all the systems are really connected. As we get stronger hurricanes, our research has showed that it reduces the ability of the ocean to store carbon in deep sediments. Those are feedback mechanisms that once you flip that switch and start changing climate, things change really rapidly.
Wow. This is incredible, because you talked about fires on the West Coast, and I would never really connect the massive fires to climate change. But if there's so much information and facts behind this, then how could there be a denial that climate change exists? But we're going to go to break, and when we come back, let's pick up on the denial about climate change existing at all.
Absolutely.
Legitimate Matters, your host, William Parris. This is a hot topic. Come back. There's more.
Climate change. It's real, it's serious, and it's up to us to solve it. In the last 2 decades, we've experienced 14 of the hottest 15 years on record. By 2050, drought and chronic water shortages could impact 1 billion people, while millions more will be at risk from coastal flooding. It can seem overwhelming, but there's reason for hope. If we embrace solar and wind power to their full potential, we can cut the world's yearly carbon emissions by 1/3. Already, Germany generates 27% of its electricity from renewables, with a goal of 80% by 2050. Denmark has shown it can produce more wind energy than it can use, and England is building the world's biggest offshore wind farm. Communities large and small are taking steps. A new public building in Mexico City has an exterior that breaks down air pollutants, erasing the effects of 1,000 cars each day. Paris installed street tiles that harvest energy from foot traffic. Other cities are paving streets with smog-eating concrete and sidewalks with recycled materials. Individuals can make a difference too, through the choices we make every day. If every American driver drove 10 miles less each week, it could eliminate more than 100 billion pounds of carbon from the air each year. New innovations are making important strides possible, and more are on the way, but we can't wait. Reimagining our world's energy future will take a shared sense of urgency from countries, companies, cities, and all of us. Working together, real change is possible. Learn more at natgeo.com/climate.
Hi, this is Rosalind Ortega with Urban Teach NYC, sitting with William Parris and Legitimate Matters. If you have not tuned into the show, this is your time to do it.
Welcome back to Legitimate Matters. Once again, I'm your host, William Parris, speaking to my guest today, Dr. Richard Smith, oceanographer. And in our last segment, we were talking about the facts that your studies uncover, but yet there's so much denial and such a debate in our government, and certainly denial in the current administration about the reality of climate change. What's your thoughts on that?
It's really just a shame. It prolongs us doing what we absolutely need to do, which is drastically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and move towards renewable energy. When Yale did a study where they did a climate communication study where they polled Americans, and 70% of people, it's not even a bipartisan issue, support research into renewable energy. So that's where we need to be moving. So to somehow go backwards towards having a higher dependence on coal and oil and gas, it's not where we need to go. And I think if more people knew the threats and knew the science, once again, they have somehow got it into the Americans' perception that there's a debate over climate change, and that's absolutely not true.
Wow.
As scientists, what we look for is how quick is this change going to happen? What's going to be the absolute magnitude of it? We know where the CO2 is coming from. We understand the carbon cycle. We know how this is overprinted on top of it. We know about ice sheets. We know how sea level rises. We look at all these different climate stages in the past. So for someone to say that the climate changes naturally, well, as a scientist, I would say, well, absolutely, but not like this. We know how it's changed in the past.
Because it's happening so rapidly, as you have pointed out on this show. So, how is the ocean at this particular point in such danger? What is the reality of this danger?
So the reality is that the ocean is taking up a lot of the CO2 that we've put into the atmosphere, about 40% of that, at its own expense. It's just like a soda can. The reason that your soda is acidic is because there's dissolved CO2 in it. So you dissolve CO2 in the ocean and you make it less alkaline, you make it more acidic. The ocean's about 30% more acidic now than it was in the pre-industrial period. That causes problems for all sorts of wildlife in the base of the food chain. The ocean's taken up a huge portion of the heat that we've put into the atmosphere, and there are also that also devastates certain ecosystems in the ocean and completely changes the way it can have huge impacts towards things like ocean circulation. So overprinted on top of these climate changes are things like overfishing. We overexploit the ocean. To a large degree. At this point, most of the large fish in the ocean, things like sharks, and I mentioned this a little bit in our previous episode, 90% of them have already been fished out. That's past a tipping point that we will never get them back 90%. With their previous genetic diversity.
I think that's really something to point out. You said 90%, and you mentioned sharks. In particular, and this is something that we just take for granted as being part of ocean wildlife. And there's more going on in that respect as well.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up sharks. There's actually a real problem facing them. It's called shark finning. Shark finning is whereby large industrial factory type ships or even smaller boats will catch sharks in the ocean and cut their fins off and return the shark to die in the water.
Wow.
And this is really a global problem. In fact, upwards of 100 million sharks are killed this way every year.
Is there a reason for that?
It's because the dried shark fin is worth quite a bit of money in some countries, used as all sorts of different reasons, high nutrition or medicinal value. So it's a prized thing, which works maybe on a small scale, but not on this industrial scale. And we've always had this sense of the ocean that it can contain whatever we throw at it because it's so big. We can pump as many pollutants into it as we want, and they'll just dilute and go out to sea. We can we can exploit fish populations because there's so many of them that we can't impact it. And the science shows that that's absolutely not true. We're impacting the ocean in every way possible. And it's going to come back to bite us.
Well, it's coming back to bite us. And here's my question for you. Considering the research that you're doing, which is clearly extremely important, as it does affect not just the future of the ocean, but the future of humanity and the planet, but how does the information that you gather, these types of facts, then how is that, what do you do with that information in order to, in order to make a difference? So you've done the studies, you have the information, you have the facts. Now what?
When we start to understand to what degree we're impacting the ocean and understand how our behavior affects it, we can start to make changes in our everyday life. We can also start to make changes by who we vote into office. What's their record of recognizing the science? You can't have a political debate about where to go in the future if you don't take the science as fact. The scientific method is the best way we have to understand what's going on with the world as a whole.
Well, then I would think it's safe to say that with the upcoming midterm elections in 2018, when we talk about what viewers can do to get involved and the difference that they could make, considering that these types of threats to the planet, if you care about your family, will certainly affect your children and your children's children. And if you take this serious, and this is a very, very serious topic, all things considered, then voting is crucial. To be able to do your homework and research the political figures that are making a difference, that are standing behind the changes necessary to address climate change. And if you're not, then it's just irresponsible to have people in office that don't take the future of humanity, your children, your grandchildren, and this planet into consideration. If you're not on board, then you need to be replaced. That's my opinion, and I believe that I'm right. That's how I feel.
Absolutely. It's the most important thing we can do to decide what direction we're going to go into. It is the globe as a whole.
Right.
And the way we can do that is by looking at our public figures' records on science, because we need to take the science for granted. We need to have a consensus on scientific fact and build policy based on that.
Right.
So when people erode at the facts, when we live in a world where people don't know what to believe anymore, we're not going to go in a good direction environmentally or anything else.
Well, I like what you said in terms of the fact that there is no debate when it comes to climate change, and that there is a perception that the government is debating, when in fact the government is aware of the facts about climate change, but yet there's this rhetoric, or there's this dialogue that has been put out there by the current administration, might I add, because we weren't having this conversation years ago. It was understood that it needed to be addressed, and suddenly you hear words like hoax, which is ridiculous. Well, we're going to go to break, but this is really a hot topic. I'm so glad that we went there, and I hope that my viewers are paying attention, because yes, you can get involved. We're going to go to break, and when we come back, we're going to continue this amazing conversation with my guest, Dr. Richard Smith, William Parris, and you're watching Legitimate Matters.
Hello, I'm Stephen Matt from Tell Me Your Goal. I'm on the set of Legitimate Matters. This is a show you should definitely check out. There's a lot of good stuff on here. And if you want to learn more, you can find Legitimate Matters on Facebook and YouTube by typing in Legitimate Matters.
Welcome back to Legitimate Matters. This is your host, William Parris, having a great conversation with my guest, Dr. Richard Smith, oceanographer. Rick, when we, throughout this whole conversation, we've been talking about the crisis and threats to the ocean. We're talking about all kinds of things that the viewer should really be aware of just in terms of personal health. But I'd like to really talk about the takeaways from this great conversation. We talked about government, and let's hit back home again about what the viewer can do in terms of being involved. What role can they play in making a difference?
Well, we talked about voting. One of the other things I'd like to bring up is education. Most people want to do the right thing, and these issues are really important to everybody. Everyone wants their families to be healthy and happy and live good lives and pass that down to their children and their children. So the more we teach people about what's going on and the more we demystify the science, and the more we allowed people to wade through the muddy waters of disinformation and find out what is actually going on, the better choices they can make. You can get involved in local environmental organizations, or they may help you to find the correct science. Things such as that.
Well, when I think in terms of oceanography, which for me, when you and I met, as a matter of fact, I couldn't have been more excited about it. I just meeting you was just exciting because of what you do, and not to mention the fact that you're just a great person. But my question is, what is it about oceanography that besides what we've talked about, is so exciting for you that our viewers should know about if they said to themselves, oceanography, I never thought about that for, a degree in oceanography. Why should they consider this?
I will say that oceanography has enriched my life in ways that I can barely even describe. I've been out on boats all over the world. I've seen things that I didn't even know existed. There's so much interesting life out there. This is something I've been passionate about my whole life. When I was a kid, I would drop a line in the water and see what clamped onto the other end, and you never knew what it was going to be. So there are still so many more mysteries to unravel. It's really the last unknown frontier.
You mentioned in a previous segment that we know more about the moon than we do about the ocean. And I thought that that was such a fascinating statement to make, considering you don't have millions of people traveling to Mars, but you have millions on top of millions of people who have access to the ocean, yet we know so little about it. And you also talked about the depth of the ocean and how there is marine life that we know so little about. How is that even possible? And is that something for someone considering higher education to consider?
Absolutely. And so we know a lot about our coastlines because we can scuba dive or snorkel or swim underwater and directly observe them. A lot of what we do in the open ocean is very much on the surface, where the average depths are 4,000 meters. Only in the last few decades have we unraveled that there's a gigantic mountain chain that runs through the middle of the Atlantic, called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This is where we think life on Earth actually started. There are organisms there doing amazing chemical reactions that we didn't really know about before, or organisms with amazing adaptations to heat. So the bottom of the ocean is super high pressures, extremely cold, and we go down in submersibles, but we only get a snapshot. So yes, if you want to get into a fascinating area of study where you can really, the potential for discovery is huge, oceanography is the thing to get into, and there's opportunities all over.
So are there any particular schools that you might recommend for this type of study?
It's difficult to recommend a specific school because there are universities all over that have these types of programs. So see what's in your area, or what area of the country you would like to live in, because if you're going to do an advanced degree, you're going to be there for 4, maybe 6 years. So make sure it's a place you want to live. Obviously, we have Scripps Oceanographic Institute. We have Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which the Texas A&M University Department of Oceanography, which is where I went. But there are programs all over the country, and internationally too. If you want to travel and live in another country for a few years, science is a great way to do that.
Wow, that's amazing. I would never have thought that there were so many opportunities.
All over the place.
So also, in terms of, let's talk seafood for a moment. I've heard things about farm raised versus wild versus farm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's the difference, and is this something that we should take into more consideration?
Yeah, so basically as we realized that we were overexploiting our marine resources, we've started to move towards farming, towards aquaculturing, and in fact now more than 50% of all our seafood comes from aquaculturing. But it depends on how you do it. So for example, Atlantic salmon, actually some of these salmon are farmed in the fjords in Norway, but you have a lot of issues. One of the issues is that often they're fed ground up fish, and those fish are taken from the ocean. Another thing is, what do you do with all the nutrient waste that comes from these fish farms? So it's not so clear cut as wild versus farmed, it's how they're farmed, what sort of habitats had to be destroyed to create these large farms. So what people should have is a good resource to go to and figure out, if I care about the oceans, what should I be eating in terms of seafood? There's a great website that I use called seafoodwatch.org that lays it all out. The good choices, mediocre choices, and the poorest choices.
Wow. So that way that way we can actually determine what is it just what's most healthy, the healthiest for us, or is it just being more environmentally responsible?
That's a great point, because there are some fish that have more contaminants in them. Typically, as you move up the food chain, there's more contaminants because they bioaccumulate. These are things like PCBs or mercury, for example. So there is a difference between what's healthy for us and what's healthy for the oceans.
What is a PCB?
It's polychlorinated biphenyls, and these are contaminants that bioaccumulate up the food chain, and they never really go away, and we get doses of them when we eat seafood that's contaminated with them. They move into our bodies and our tissues and stick around for long periods of time, and it can cause severe health effects.
Really? Wow. Okay, so I had no idea that would be the case. Well, this has been a great conversation, Rick. I can talk to you for hours, but I'm sure that there are viewers that have questions for you or have information. If someone was interested in understanding more about what it is you do, well, first of all, do you have a website, and how can they reach you?
So please feel free to contact me with any questions. If you want to know what you can do personally in terms of to make your relationship with the ocean and the ocean's health and your own health more sustainable, you can contact me at globalaquaticresearch.com. My website is www.globalaquaticresearch.com. And we're going to be here for a long time continuing to research these issues and basically allowing humans to have a more sustainable existence with the ocean. That's my passion, and that's what I aim to do in life. So.
You have been an amazing guest.
Thank you for having me, William.
Dr. Smith, I want you to come back. We're going to keep in touch and find another date and another opportunity for you to be a guest on my show. And for those of you who are watching, I appreciate you tuning in. I'm your host, William Parris. All of my shows can be found on YouTube. You just need to search under Legitimate Matters, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This is William Parris, your host. Thanks for watching. This is Legitimate Matters.